Hey, hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Why Excess Liability Matters. My name is Alexa Hill, and I'm the Marketing Manager here at CID. Today we have three of our underwriters joining us to share their expertise and talk a little bit more about excess liability and why it matters. We have Teresa Cochran, one of our commercial new business underwriters, Michelle Belden, another one of our commercial new business underwriters, and Jessica Swigart, our renewal commercial new business underwriter. Now, as you can tell, you are all muted, but there is a chat feature where you can type your questions in and we'll get them answered throughout the webinar. Your voice is very important to us and we want to make sure that all your questions are answered, so please feel free to chat them in at any time. And we are going to have a couple polls throughout our webinar today. So first, we are going to do a fun poll just to make sure that our polls are working properly. You should see it pop up on your screen and then you can just click your answer and it will submit. Okay, well, it looks like it is working. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Michelle to get us started.
Hi, everyone. I am Michelle. I am a new business underwriter here at CAD. So I'm going to go over our objectives today, and then we'll dive into the meat and potatoes of this presentation. So the main purpose of this was for us to be able to explain excess liability coverage to you guys, and just, go over the things that we know that you may not know, just to pass that information along. So one of the first things we want to do is kind of set the tone of the difference between a commercial excess policy versus a commercial umbrella policy. A lot of times you'll hear these terms used interchangeably. It really is, though, they truly are two different types of coverages. It really comes down to the policy form. For the purpose of this, our main focus will be excess liability, but we will cover just, a brief definition of an umbrella coverage as well. So within the excess liability, we want to talk about the different types of excess policies there are, and what they can cover and what they don't cover. So we'll go into that as well. We'll also talk about why this coverage is needed. It's becoming more and more prevalent. It's on the rise. We're constantly getting requests for it because people have contracts that needing it. People just, want that peace of mind to have higher coverage. So they want a greater limit that their underlying policy can't handle. So there's, a few different reasons why that coverage is needed. Then we're also going to talk about what is needed for us to be able to quote the excess, so we can get that done for you guys quickly. And then, like Alexa said, you can throw your questions in the chat throughout. We'll answer them. And then also, if there's any additional questions at the end, we're happy to answer those as well. So we're going to talk about what excess liability coverage is. So it is additional insurance to their underlying policy. So their underlying general liability policy, whether their general liability policy is written on a monoline basis or on a package or a bought policy, it's additional coverage going over that liability to give them higher limits. And I do want to highlight the word additional insurance. So a lot of times we get a request for excess because somebody needs 2-4 limits. And unfortunately, their underlying carrier can't handle 2-4 limits. So they can only offer a 1-2. So a lot of people will say, okay, well, I need a $2 million excess, thinking that if I get the $2 million excess, I'm getting 2-4 limits. Technically, well, not technically, realistically, you're actually getting 3-4 limits because you're adding that additional 2 million to your 1-2 occurrence and aggregate limits. So if you have a $1 million occurrence and you have a $2 million excess, you're going to add that together. So 1 + 2 is 3. So we do get a lot of people who get kind of confused on that. It's an addition to the limit, not a multiplication. So I just wanted to highlight that there. Also, the coverage, like I said, is generally purchased because they need higher limits, whether that is for a contract, peace of mind, etc. Not only can an excess or an umbrella policy go over just a general liability, it can also go over a commercial auto policy, an employer's liability policy, and then some other business insurance can. If you have like a professional policy, there is a separate type of professional excess you can get. So there are various types of excess policies, but our focus today will be on excess for commercial lines. And again, like I said, excess liability is going to increase your limit of liability, but it's not going to broaden your coverage. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides about the types of how the coverage works. So underlying coverage, you'll hear me saying that a lot, or all of us saying that a lot throughout the presentation. So underlying insurance is your primary insurance policy. So that is your first line of coverage that would pay out in the event of a claim. So that's either your monoline GL policy, your package policy, your BOP policy. So wherever that underlying coverage, your first line limits are, that would be what we're referring to as your underlying insurance. So when we're asking for, we need a copy of your underlying policy, that is what we are referring to. Again, this would be the first policy to respond in the event of a claim. So you would have to maximize and max out your limits, have reached that limit, paid out the $1 million or $2 million, whatever your underlying limits may be, before an excess policy would kick in to potentially pay out for a claim. And then also a condition of an excess policy is that you maintain your underlying insurance. So what we mean by that is you need to have underlying insurance in place. You need to have that GL policy in place and keep it active. Because if you don't have a active underlying policy, there's not really a point in having an excess policy because it has nothing to really go over. So you're basically paying for something for nothing. So that's why it's really important that insurance maintain their underlying policy, whether that's monoline GL, a package, making sure they have that coverage so that when they have their excess policy, it's something that can still be viable. You don't want to just be paying for nothing. All right. So, like I said, our focus today will be on excess liability, but I do want to go over just a brief definition of what an umbrella coverage is. So an umbrella coverage, similar to an excess coverage, is also going over your underlying policy and can also go over those other lines of coverages I discussed, commercial auto, employer's liability. So that's something else. So for an umbrella, it's a more broad definition because it has more flexibility in the sense that the coverage form, something that could potentially be, possibly excluded on your underlying policy. There might be like an A and B exclusion. On an umbrella policy, there could be a spot where they don't have an exclusion for assault and battery. So they could potentially pick up a claim under the umbrella policy that's not necessarily something that would follow on the underlying policy. So an umbrella policy, in that sense, it's generally a broader range of coverages and events that could be able to be supported and have a claim that could be filed to that potentially your underlying could not. For us, what we sell is primarily excess liability. So we just wanted to give you guys a little definition just so you have an idea of what the difference, because if you send us an email and say, hey, I need an umbrella, we're likely going to send you an excess quote because that's pretty much what our markets are offering. But we do, we recognize both terms interchangeably, like I said. All right, so we're going to talk about the different types of excess policies. So you have a follow form policy, a self-contained policy, and a combination policy. We're going to go into more definitions on these ones in the coming slides. I do want to say for us, we will primarily be either giving, if you're getting a quote from us, we'll either be on a follow form basis or a combination basis. Just depends on the carrier and the risk and what we're able to offer. Okay, so for this one, the follow form type of excess. So a follow form policy is going to follow the same terms and conditions that are on your underlying policy. So if there's an assault and battery exclusion, if there's an abuse and molestation exclusion, if there's a HAB exclusion, all these things, those are going to also follow suit on your excess. So if you had a claim for an assault and battery and so it's excluded on your underlying policy, it's also going to be excluded on the excess policy. So if you had a claim for that, there would be no insurance to be able to pick that up within the policy form. So whatever is covered on, like I said, so for it to be covered on the excess, it would have to be covered on the underlying, and vice versa. If it was on the underlying, then it would be on the excess. So it's only going to, this policy for a follow form policy, the excess is only going to kick in once the underlying limits have been exhausted. So you would have had to have a loss that was $1 million or more before your excess policy would kick in this instance. So we're going to go over an example on this one. So if you could, on the chart, you can see that we have an example of an insured that has a $1 million underlying policy, a $1 million excess policy, and they had a loss that totaled a payout of $1.25 million. So in this instance, if the underlying policy paid their first $1 million, and then we're wanting to know how much would your excess policy be picking up on this one? So if you guys want to go ahead and put your answers in the poll, that would be great. Okay. So if you guys answered the poll as 250,000, you would be correct. So like we talked about, in order for the excess to kick in, the first million had to be exhausted. So in this one, we made it simple for the math wise. You take the million, subtract out from your total loss, and you're left with 250,000. That's how much your excess policy would be paying. Now, if an insured didn't have an excess policy and they had had a loss that totaled this 1.25 million, who would be paying for the additional 250,000 if they didn't have an excess policy? The insured. So this is why it's really important, for the insured to look at having higher limits, so that they are providing themselves, coverage, that peace of mind. So, somebody likely does not have $250,000 just laying around to be able to pay out the claimant on this one. So having that coverage on their excess policy really helped them there, so they're not having to, worry about having to pay this money to the insured or to the claimant who is awarded this money. Then one other thing I want to know about follow form, we get a lot of requests about adding additional insureds to an excess policy. So additional insureds, if they are included on your underlying GL policy, they will automatically be included on your excess policy. They won't be specifically named, but again, we're following form. So if it's a AI for a landlord, an AI for a mortgage company, an AI for a contract, if they are able and eligible to be included on your underlying GL, and then they will be included on your excess policy. They're just not specifically named. So we'll get those requests. We're like, hey, we need to name this person as AI on the excess policy. We won't name them, but we'll remind you, like, as long as they're, eligible to be named on the underlying policy, then they're fine on the umbrella. They would be included from a coverage perspective as well. Okay, so we're also going to talk about a self-contained excess and a combination excess. Self-contained means that it follows its own rules and definitions. So regardless of if there's an exclusion or something's included on an underlying policy, the self-contained excess liability, they make their own rules. So if they want to have an exclusion for something, they'll have an exclusion for something, regardless of it's included on your underlying policy. So self-contained can be helpful, it can not, because you could potentially open yourself up for gaps in coverage, depending on, if maybe you have a sublimit of assault and battery on your underlying policy, but then there's a full-blown exclusion on the excess in a self-contained instance. Well, if you had a loss, say you had a sublimit of 250,000 for assault and battery, but you ended up having a loss that had 500,000, that additional 250,000 that would need to be picked up would not be picked up on a self-contained policy if they had an A and B exclusion. So it's really important to make sure you're reading through the forms, and what types of exclusions there are and what's included, so everything knows. So for us, like I said, we primarily, our carriers are either going to offer a follow form or a combination. We don't really have anything for ourselves within our office that we sell that would be on a self-contained basis, but it is just an important thing to highlight and note, just so that you can understand where you're coming from, and you just, always making sure to look through those forms and make sure, things are where you need to be. There's always potential for form negotiation with a carrier. So if there's something that's, excluded, you can always ask, and we can always ask to see if it's something that could be removed, or if we could find some sort of workaround to be able to include that. But I'm going to primarily focus on combination type of excess. So this kind of blends follow form and self-contained together. So this makes the policies have rules and definitions of the exclusions that could be standard, which you would see on a follow form policy. But then it can have its own conditions where we could have, a unique exposure where on an excess policy, we could potentially add maybe a form on where there's an exclusion here, or vice versa, there's an exclusion here, but we need something else. So we can maybe find a potential workaround. So like I was saying, it's often where we see this the most, that works, is with types of risks that we've been seeing this a lot on, would be bars, childcare, or habitational. So with the types of exclusions we have listed here on the screen, those are a lot of times where we see, like, potentially there's an exclusion on the underlying, or only a sublimit here, and then on the excess, they're either fully excluded, not excluded. So there tends to be like a little bit of a workaround. So when there's those contract reasons that they need these higher limits or just why they need the higher limits in general, it's really important that you're looking at the forms and not just getting an excess policy just to get an excess policy to meet the limit requirement. You also want to make sure you're checking the forms, make sure you're meeting form requirements as well. Um, so I will give an example of a combination policy before I transfer this over. So we have an insured who is trying to get a contract with a school district to offer an after-school program, and the school requires that they have $5 million in abuse and molestation coverage. The insured's underlying policy includes $1 million in abuse and molestation. If the excess liability had a stated exclusion for abuse and molestation, and there is a loss awarding a claimant, and this loss would be an A&M loss, $1.5 million, the maximum the carrier or the claimant would be awarded would only be $1 million from the underlying policy, and no coverage would be awarded on the excess policy due to an A&M exclusion. So therefore, again, we would be going back to the insured would be left paying the difference of that 500,000 in this event in the claim. So this is why it's really important not only to just, look to meet limit requirements, but to make sure you're looking to meet form requirements so that you're not having gaps in coverage. You want to try to make sure, keep things as seamless as possible. Not always the case that you can work around to be able to remove exclusions and this or that, but it's really important to highlight both of those when you're like looking at with the insured. Not only are we meeting limit requirements, but are we meeting like the contract of what we need to carry the coverage for? Because you could get the excess, a $5 million excess, and but that could potentially only be going over your GL limits and not going over your abuse and molestation limits. So it's really important to make sure you're looking at those exclusions to see what is there and what is not. So you're providing your insured the correct coverage so that they can meet these contract requirements accordingly and so that they do have the coverage in the event of a loss. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and transfer this over to Teresa for the next section. So I appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. Now that we've defined and reviewed the types of excess policies, let's get into the details. Here is a list of our next topics. So let's get started with coverage territory. Your typical ISO form general liability policy covers the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico, whereas an excess and umbrella policy will usually provide worldwide coverage and requires that the lawsuit be filed within the United States or Canada. What does it mean when we say that excess and umbrella carriers require the maintenance of underlying coverage? We are trying to say that certain criteria must be met in order to qualify for excess and umbrella coverage. For instance, the underlying coverage must be at a minimum limit of liability. Every carrier has different underlying limit requirements, but I would say that most of our carriers require that the underlying GL limits be 1 million per occurrence, 2 million aggregate in order to be eligible for an excess or umbrella quote. Other underlying policy conditions will vary depending on the type of risk and carrier requirements. What would happen if a claim occurs and the underlying general liability limits are not maintained? The excess or umbrella policy will be triggered, but only for the amount that exceeds the limit that the underlying carrier was to maintain. In this claim example, the insured suffered a $1.5 million loss. The underlying general liability policy ended up canceling midterm. Let's say the policy lapsed due to failure to pay or something like that. And they were supposed to have maintained a 1 million per occurrence general liability policy. The insured does have an excess or umbrella policy with coverage at a 2 million policy limit still in force. How do you think the excess or umbrella policy will pay out on this $1.5 million loss? If you wouldn't mind trying to answer this question in the poll, we'll give you a minute. Okay, that should be enough time. So those of you that chose 500,000 are correct. The insured is obligated to pay $1 million because they were supposed to have been maintaining a $1 million per occurrence GL policy. So not only does the policyholder need to pay $1 million out of pocket, you can pretty much guarantee that this excess or umbrella carrier will be non-renewing the policy due to failure to maintain underlying limits. When writing an excess or umbrella policy, it is ideal to have both the underlying policy and excess or umbrella policy with the same inception and expiration dates. This helps to prevent any gap in coverage if the underlying limits have been used to pay a claim. Most excess or umbrella policies have a clause that states the aggregate limits of the underlying policy be unimpaired, which means untouched, not exhausted, and not reduced. Of course, many times we are binding excess or umbrella coverage when the underlying general liability coverage is already in force. So in this case, we make sure the underlying GL coverage is loss-free, and we set the expiration date of the excess or umbrella to be concurrent with the underlying GL policy, so both policies expire on the same date. But let's say the insured finds a carrier that doesn't require concurrent dates and accepts losses on the current underlying general liability policy. The underlying policy dates are March 1st, 2025 through March 1st, 2026 at $1 million per occurrence, $1 million aggregate limit. The excess or umbrella policy dates are July 1st, 25 to July 1st, 2026 at a $1 million limit. The underlying policy suffered a $500,000 loss on March 15th and a $300,000 loss on May 1st. They've now had $800,000 in losses before the excess or umbrella policy took effect. Then on September 1st, which is 2 months after the excess or umbrella policy took effect, another loss occurred with the claimant awarded $400,000. How much do you think each policy will pay? Here's another poll. Go ahead and please enter your answer. Okay. If you chose $200,000 for the underlying and $200,000 for the excess or umbrella, you are correct. Seeing how fast the excess or umbrella carrier had to pay out on a loss, it makes sense that they would want the aggregate limit of the umbrella policy to be unimpaired. Jessica will now take over to discuss why excess coverage is needed.
Good morning, everyone. Let's dive into the need for excess liability coverage and why this may benefit your insureds. There are many reasons why insureds need excess liability coverage, but we're going to go over the most common situations that we see. Of course, insured wants to have protection in place for their business in the event of an unexpected loss. The most frequent requests we get for excess liability coverage are due to contractual requirements, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. Certain risks may also choose to obtain higher limits since they cannot predict how a loss could impact their business in the future, which in turn can bring them peace of mind. As I mentioned, one of the main reasons insureds are seeking higher limits is due to contractual agreements. Most commonly, we see this with contractors who are required to have higher limits for a specific project. But we also see this as part of large corporate vendor contracts, city requirements, and with nonprofit risks to be eligible for grants. Tying into contractual agreements, we also commonly see this as a landlord requirement for a lease agreement or as a lender requirement, which we're frequently seeing on habitational risks. One important factor when considering higher limits that's often overlooked is when risks have an underlying policy with a shared limit or have multiple locations on the same policy. A lot of the time, the liability limits are on a per policy basis and not per location. Therefore, multiple locations are sharing the liability limits. Having excess liability can help offer more coverage in the event the insured has losses between multiple locations that exceed their underlying policy limit. And carriers have also been more reserved when it comes to the limits they're willing to offer on underlying policies.
We have instances where a carrier that previously was able to offer $2 million per occurrence, $4 million aggregate limits, is now only able to offer $1 million per occurrence, $2 million aggregate limits, requiring the insured to find excess coverage to bridge that gap. In this specific example, the insured would need a $2 million excess policy to maintain the necessary total $4 million aggregate limit. As the renewal business commercial underwriter at CID, I'm seeing a lot more requests for excess liability. I highly recommend reaching out to the insured and going over the benefits of excess liability coverage when discussing their renewal. So here's the list of the minimum requirements for an excess liability submission. However, this is not an all-inclusive list, as each market may have other requirements outside of this, such as a supplemental application or a copy of the contract that requires the insured to have higher limits. The underlying loss runs should be currently valued, meaning they have been ran within the last 60 days, and the underlying policy must be provided for the term the insured intends for the excess liability to go over. For example, if the insured's underlying policy expires on September 1st of 2026, and they're looking to get excess liability in place with their upcoming renewal, then we would need a copy of either their 2026 to 2027 renewal quote or policy, as we cannot work off the expiring 2025 to 2026 underlying policy for that excess quote. I will add that when we are already controlling the underlying policy, we can get away with obtaining an excess quote subject to applications. In fact, a lot of our markets have been offering optional excess liability quotes in conjunction with the renewal due to the increasing demand for higher limits. Ultimately, excess and umbrella policies are there to provide the insured additional liability limits, whether that be due to a contract or simply because they want the additional layer of protection. Opening up the conversation with the insured is the first place to start in determining if exploring higher limits is something they should consider. Now I'm going to pass it off to Alexa for closing remarks and questions.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. I do see that we had one question come in a little bit ago. I can read it aloud. The question is, if the award limit goes beyond the underlying and the excess policy becomes involved, does the excess policy become involved with or required to contribute to the defense cost expended by the primary?
Honestly, it really probably depend on the claim scenario and what the loss is. I could see where, the payout shifts to it being the primary paying more on an expense side, and so then on the excess side, you're picking up more of the cost of true, not towards expenses, but towards the loss itself. So I can't really answer that one specifically, but that's kind of how I would look at it, how I would see it. But again, each claim is going to be on its own basis. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, none of us are claims adjusters. We did not sign up for that job. So it would come down between them. So if, there was something like that, honestly, it would be the claims adjusters from each carrier. If they had a primary policy and an excess policy with different carriers, they would be speaking with each other and determining how the payout is gonna, if you've exhausted the limits on your primary policy before you go to your excess policy.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle. I do see, Patricia, you have a hand raised. Could you chat in your question, then we'll get that answered. I also saw that someone asked when this will be recorded and posted to the website. I will get on it. It'll be done by the end of today, and I'll get those emails over to you all with the recording. If anyone does have any other questions, please chat them in. I do see one here. Oh, someone asked, please advise if you can add a separate AI to the excess. We talked about this a little bit.
Yeah, so going back to that, so if you if an excess is, or if a AI is included on your underlying GL policy, then it's automatically going to follow form onto your excess policy. We'll never specifically name an AI on an umbrella or excess policy, so you won't get like an endorsement like you would get for like a landlord AI or mortgagee AI like you get on your underlying GL policy. You're not going to get that on the excess. There's not going to be a specific endorsement that names them, but as long as they are covered on their underlying policy, then it would follow form and be included on the excess, just not named.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, great. Well, if any questions do come up later on, you can always reach out to Michelle and Teresa on the new business side and Jessica on the renewal side. They would be happy to answer any questions that you all have. And I do encourage you to all browse our website at cidinsurance.com. We do have tons of tools for you and your office to use on there. And if you do have any excess submissions, you can send them over to our submissions email at submissions@cidinsurance.com. So if we don't have any other questions in the chat, that will do for today's webinar. We do appreciate you all joining us today, and we look forward to doing business with you. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.